April 1964. The courtroom on the fourth floor of the New York County Criminal Court building occupied a high-ceilinged space with tall windows that overlooked Center Street. The room held wooden benches for spectators, a jury box along one wall, and a raised bench where the judge presided over proceedings. At 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, approximately 40 people sat in the gallery, most of them observers from the legal community, journalists covering criminal cases, and a few Harlem residents who had come to witness proceedings involving Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Johnson sat at the defense table wearing a charcoal gray suit, white shirt, and dark blue tie. He was 58 years old, recently released from federal prison after serving 11 years on a heroin conspiracy conviction. He had spent most of that sentence at Alcatraz, the maximum security facility in San Francisco Bay, designed to isolate the most dangerous federal prisoners from society and from their criminal organizations. Johnson had been released in August 1963, and in the 8 months since returning to Harlem, he had resumed involvement in the neighborhood's criminal economy while attempting to navigate parole requirements and ongoing law enforcement attention. The hearing that morning concerned a parole violation allegation. Johnson's parole terms prohibited him from associating with known criminals or frequenting establishments where criminal activity occurred. The New York District Attorney's Office had filed a petition claiming that Johnson had violated these terms by being present at a nightclub on 125th Street, where police had observed several individuals with criminal records. If the parole violation was sustained, Johnson could be returned to federal custody to serve the remainder of his original sentence. The assistant district attorney handling the case was named Robert Chambers. He was 34 years old, a graduate of Columbia Law School who had joined the district attorney's office 6 years earlier and had built a reputation for aggressive prosecution of organized crime cases. Chambers was ambitious, intelligent, and confident in his legal abilities. He had prepared thoroughly for this hearing, gathering witness statements from police officers, photographic evidence of Johnson's presence at the nightclub, and documentation of the criminal records of other individuals who had been present. The hearing began with Chambers presenting his evidence. He called 3 police officers who testified about conducting surveillance at the nightclub and observing Johnson in conversation with several individuals the officers recognized from previous arrests. Chambers introduced photographs taken during the surveillance, showing Johnson seated at a table with these individuals. He submitted certified copies of criminal records documenting prior convictions for the people Johnson had been observed with. After presenting this evidence, Chambers made a statement to the court about the nature of parole violation proceedings and the standards of proof required. He noted that parole violation hearings did not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt as criminal trials did. Instead, they required only a preponderance of evidence, more likely than not that the violation occurred. He argued that the evidence clearly established that Johnson had been present at a location frequented by known criminals and had associated with individuals who had criminal records, both of which violated his parole terms. Then, Chambers made a rhetorical choice that revealed both his confidence and his misunderstanding of the situation. He turned toward the defense table and addressed remarks directly to Johnson, rather than limiting his comments to the judge. He noted that Johnson's intelligence and sophistication were well known. He suggested that Johnson understood the legal technicalities of parole violation proceedings and had calculated that he could exploit ambiguities in the parole terms. He stated that Johnson's presence at the nightclub was not coincidental or innocent, but rather represented a deliberate testing of the boundaries of what parole supervision would tolerate. Chambers continued in this vein for several minutes, characterizing Johnson as someone who believed he could outsmart the legal system through clever interpretation of rules and through intimidating witnesses or officials. He suggested that Johnson's years in federal prison had not reformed him, but had simply educated him about legal procedures he could manipulate. He concluded by stating that the court should not be deceived by Johnson's apparent compliance with some parole requirements or by his ability to present himself as a respectable businessman. The evidence showed who Johnson really was and what he was really doing in Harlem. Throughout this presentation, Johnson sat without visible reaction. His expression remained neutral. He did not look at Chambers while the prosecutor spoke about him. He did not confer with his attorney or make notes. He simply sat quietly, hands folded on the table, posture unchanged from when the hearing began. When Chambers finished his statement, the judge asked whether the defense wished to present evidence. Johnson's attorney, a respected criminal defense lawyer named Harold Steinberg, indicated that the defense would present witnesses but requested a brief recess to confer with his client. The judge granted a 15-minute recess. Johnson and Steinberg moved to a conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Steinberg asked Johnson how he wanted to respond to the evidence and arguments Chambers had presented. Johnson was quiet for a moment, then indicated that he wanted to think about the situation overnight before deciding on their response. He asked Steinberg to request that the hearing be continued to the following day, citing the need to subpoena additional witnesses whose testimony would address the allegations. Steinberg returned to the courtroom when the recess ended and made this request. Chambers objected, arguing that the defense had known about the hearing for weeks and should have prepared witnesses in advance. But the judge noted that defendants in parole violation proceedings had the right to present evidence and to call witnesses, and that a one-day continuance to allow additional preparation was reasonable. The hearing was continued to the following morning at 9:30. Johnson left the courthouse without speaking to reporters who had gathered outside. He walked to his car, was driven back to Harlem, and spent the afternoon in his apartment at Lenox Terrace. To anyone observing, it appeared to be a normal day. Johnson read newspapers, made some phone calls, received a few visitors. Nothing suggested particular concern about the hearing or about Chambers' presentation. But Johnson's mind was working systematically through what had occurred and what it revealed. Chambers' decision to address remarks directly to Johnson in court, to characterize Johnson's actions as attempts to outsmart the legal system, and to present the case as a contest between a sophisticated criminal and a determined prosecutor, showed several things about how Chambers understood the situation. Chambers believed that Johnson's power came from cleverness, from finding loopholes in rules, from intimidating people, from exploiting technical legal arguments. Chambers thought that defeating Johnson required matching this cleverness with superior legal preparation and aggressive prosecution. Chambers saw the parole violation hearing as an opportunity to demonstrate that he could not be outsmarted, that his legal skills were superior to Johnson's criminal cunning, and that bringing Johnson back into custody would be both a legal victory and a career advancement. All of these beliefs were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what Johnson actually did and where his influence actually came from. Johnson's authority in Harlem did not rest on clever interpretation of legal technicalities. It rested on relationships with community institutions, on being useful to the neighborhood in ways that made people want to protect him, on understanding how social and economic systems worked rather than just how legal systems worked. Chambers' approach in the hearing revealed that he did not understand these relationships or their significance. He thought he was prosecuting a criminal case, using evidence and legal arguments. He did not realize he was challenging someone whose position in the community created capabilities that could make legal victories irrelevant if the social and political context shifted appropriately. This misunderstanding created an opportunity. If Johnson simply defended against the parole violation through conventional legal arguments, he might win or lose based on how the judge interpreted the evidence and the parole terms. But the outcome would be determined by Chambers' framing of the case. And even if Johnson prevailed, Chambers would simply file new allegations based on different observations and continue pursuing parole revocation through repeated legal proceedings. The more strategic response was to demonstrate that Chambers' entire approach was counterproductive, and that pursuing Johnson through parole violation proceedings created costs for the district attorney's office that exceeded any benefits. This required building a coalition that could apply different forms of pressure simultaneously, creating an environment where Chambers' aggressive prosecution became a political and professional liability rather than a career opportunity. Over the next 18 hours, between the afternoon of the first hearing day and the morning when the hearing would resume, Johnson held a series of meetings with people who played various roles in Harlem's social, political, and institutional landscape. The first meeting was with Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., the congressman who represented Harlem and who was also pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church. Powell was 55 years old, one of the most powerful black political figures in America, with influence that extended across religious, political, and civil rights organizing domains. He had known Johnson for decades and understood the complex role Johnson played in Harlem's community. Johnson explained that the district attorney's office was pursuing parole violation allegations based on Johnson being present in a Harlem nightclub where other people with criminal records were also present. He noted that this standard would effectively prohibit anyone with a criminal record from participating in normal social life in Harlem, since virtually any gathering place in the neighborhood included some people who had been arrested at some point. He suggested that community leaders might want to speak about the broader implications of using parole supervision to exclude people from community participation based on guilt by association. Powell understood immediately. The issue went beyond Johnson personally. Many Harlem residents had criminal records from arrests for minor offenses, from discriminatory enforcement, or from situations where they had been swept up in police actions targeting the neighborhood. If parole terms could be used to prohibit people with records from being in the same places as other people with records, this became a tool for excluding substantial portions of the community from public life. Powell indicated he would raise this issue publicly as a civil rights concern. The second meeting was with Percy Sutton, a prominent civil rights attorney who had defended numerous activists and who had deep connections in Harlem's political and legal communities. Sutton was 43 years old, building toward his eventual election as Manhattan Borough President. But in 1964, he was known primarily as an advocate for fair treatment of black defendants in the criminal justice system. Johnson explained that prosecutors were using parole violation proceedings to circumvent the higher standards of proof required for criminal convictions. Instead of charging Johnson with new crimes and proving those charges beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury, they were using parole terms to create situations where mere presence in certain locations or association with certain people could result in re-imprisonment based on lower standards of proof and less procedural protection. This represented a systemic issue affecting anyone on parole. Sutton recognized that this was part of a larger pattern where criminal justice authorities used administrative proceedings to avoid the constitutional protections that applied to criminal trials. Documenting and challenging these practices was important for protecting the rights of all defendants, not just Johnson. Sutton agreed to examine the parole violation case as a potential example of prosecutorial overreach that deserved public attention and legal scrutiny. The third meeting was with James Hicks, editor of the Amsterdam News, Harlem's most influential newspaper. Hicks was 42 years old, a respected journalist who understood how media coverage shaped public perception of criminal justice issues. Johnson explained that the parole violation hearing represented an example of how prosecutors targeted Harlem residents differently than they targeted people in other neighborhoods. Being present at a nightclub where other people with records were also present would never be prosecuted as a parole violation in most parts of the city. But in Harlem, where discriminatory enforcement meant many residents had arrest records, this standard could be applied broadly to justify re-imprisoning people who had completed their sentences. This double standard deserved journalistic examination. Hicks understood that the story went beyond one parole hearing. It touched on larger questions about fairness in criminal justice, about how parole supervision was used as a tool for controlling communities rather than helping individuals reintegrate into society, and about whether Harlem residents received equal treatment under the law. The Amsterdam News would cover the hearing and place it in this broader context. The fourth meeting was with Dorothy Height, a leader in civil rights and community organizations, including the National Council of Negro Women. Height was 51 years old, deeply embedded in networks of activists and community advocates who worked on issues affecting black families and communities. Johnson explained that aggressive parole supervision that prohibited people from participating in normal community life made successful reintegration after incarceration nearly impossible. People released from prison needed to rebuild social connections, find employment, and participate in their neighborhoods. If parole terms were interpreted to prohibit being in places where other formerly incarcerated people might be present, this created impossible conditions that set people up for failure and return to custody. Height recognized that this was exactly the kind of systemic barrier that her organizations worked to identify and address. Successful reintegration after incarceration was a community concern, and parole supervision that made reintegration impossible needed to be challenged. Height agreed that her networks would examine how parole terms were being enforced and whether enforcement patterns created unreasonable obstacles to community participation. While these meetings were creating an observation and advocacy framework that would contextualize the hearing in broader civil rights and criminal justice terms, Johnson's attorney, Harold Steinberg, was preparing the legal response that would be presented when the hearing resumed. Steinberg subpoenaed the owner of the nightclub where Johnson had been observed. The owner was a respected Harlem businessman who had operated the establishment for 15 years and who maintained good relationships with community organizations and local officials. Steinberg prepared questions for the owner about the nature of his business, the clientele it served, and whether the establishment was known as a place where criminal activity occurred. Steinberg also subpoenaed several of the individuals who had been present at the nightclub on the night Johnson was observed there. These were people who had criminal records but who were currently employed in legitimate jobs and who participated actively in community life. Steinberg prepared to question them about why they had been at the nightclub and whether they had been engaged in any criminal activity. Additionally, Steinberg prepared legal memoranda addressing the interpretation of parole terms and the standards that should apply in determining whether someone on parole had violated conditions. The memoranda cited cases establishing that parole restriction should be interpreted narrowly, and that mere presence in a location where other people with records might be present did not constitute association for purposes of parole violation. By the evening of the first hearing day, multiple preparation efforts were underway. Johnson's legal defense was being prepared through conventional channels: witnesses, evidence, legal arguments. But simultaneously, the broader context in which the hearing would be understood was being shaped through community leaders, civil rights advocates, media attention, and organizational scrutiny of parole enforcement patterns. When the hearing resumed at 9:30 the following morning, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted subtly. More observers were present in the gallery, including several people known to be associated with civil rights organizations. Reporters from multiple newspapers attended, not just the court reporter who had been present the previous day. The proceeding that Chambers had framed as a routine parole violation hearing had attracted attention that made it less routine. Steinberg presented the defense case methodically. The nightclub owner testified that his establishment was a legitimate business serving Harlem residents, that it was not known as a location where criminal activity occurred, and that police had never cited any violations or problems with how he operated. The individuals who had been present on the night in question testified that they were employed in legitimate jobs, that they were not engaged in criminal activity, and that they had been at the nightclub for ordinary social purposes. Steinberg introduced evidence showing that Johnson's activities since his release from prison had been focused on legitimate business ventures and on compliance with most parole requirements. He presented testimony from Johnson's parole officer indicating that Johnson had reported regularly, had maintained steady employment, and had created no problems beyond the allegations in the current proceeding. Then Steinberg made legal arguments about how parole terms should be interpreted. He noted that prohibiting association with known criminals had to be understood reasonably. If interpreted to mean that someone on parole could not be in the same location as anyone else who had ever been convicted of a crime, this would make normal life impossible, especially in communities where discriminatory enforcement meant many residents had arrest records. The parole term should be interpreted to prohibit active collaboration in criminal activity, not mere presence in the same social space as other people who happened to have records. While Steinberg was presenting this defense, the broader context that Johnson's meetings had established was beginning to manifest publicly. During the lunch recess, Reverend Powell held a press conference outside the courthouse. He spoke about parole supervision being used as a tool to exclude people from community participation based on guilt by association. He noted that many Harlem residents had criminal records from minor offenses or discriminatory enforcement, and that prohibiting these people from being in the same places would effectively segregate substantial portions of the community from normal social life. He characterized this as a civil rights issue that deserved attention from community advocates and civil liberties organizations. Powell's statement was covered by multiple newspapers and was broadcast on radio news programs. It framed the hearing not as a simple parole violation case, but as an example of potentially discriminatory enforcement of parole conditions. This framing created pressure on the district attorney's office to justify why the case was being prosecuted and whether similar standards were being applied to parolees in other neighborhoods. Percy Sutton released a statement to the press analyzing the legal issues in the hearing. He noted that parole violation proceedings use lower standards of proof than criminal trials, but could result in years of incarceration, raising questions about whether this process provided adequate due process protection. He suggested that the case highlighted broader concerns about how administrative proceedings were used to circumvent constitutional protections that applied to criminal prosecutions. James Hicks published an article in the Amsterdam News examining the hearing in the context of parole enforcement patterns. The article compared how parole violations were prosecuted in different neighborhoods and questioned whether Harlem residents faced more aggressive supervision and more expansive interpretations of violation standards than parolees in other parts of the city. The article presented the hearing as potentially emblematic of broader disparities in criminal justice. Dorothy Heights organizations began documenting obstacles that parolees faced in reintegrating into Harlem communities. They collected information about how parole restrictions were interpreted and enforced, and they identified patterns where supervision requirements made normal community participation difficult or impossible. This documentation was shared with civil rights organizations and with media outlets covering criminal justice issues. By the afternoon of the second hearing day, what Chambers had intended as a straightforward prosecution of a parole violation had become a focal point for broader discussions about fairness in criminal justice, discriminatory enforcement, and the use of parole supervision as a tool for social control. The hearing was no longer just about whether Johnson had violated his parole terms. It had become a referendum on whether the district attorney's office was applying different standards to Harlem residents than to parolees in other neighborhoods. This shift in context created problems for Chambers. His aggressive presentation on the first day had framed the case as a personal contest between himself and Johnson, emphasizing his determination to prevent Johnson from outsmarting the legal system. But the broader context that had emerged made the prosecution appear less like vigorous enforcement of parole conditions and more like selective targeting of a prominent Harlem figure using standards that would not be applied elsewhere. When the hearing concluded on the second day, the judge took the case under advisement, indicating he would issue a written decision within a week. But before that decision was issued, the political pressure that had been generated through community advocacy and media attention began having effects. The district attorney received inquiries from civil rights organizations asking about parole violation prosecution policies and whether statistical disparities existed in how such cases were handled in different neighborhoods. The questions were framed as requests for information rather than accusations, but they created a need for the office to examine and justify its practices. Several city council members representing Harlem districts contacted the district attorney's office, asking about the Johnson case and whether it represented appropriate use of prosecutorial resources. They noted constituent concerns about discriminatory enforcement and asked for explanation of why this particular case merited such aggressive prosecution. The New York Civil Liberties Union announced it was examining parole enforcement patterns and considering whether systemic challenges to certain practices might be warranted. They cited the Johnson case as an example that had raised questions deserving further investigation. These inquiries and announcements created attention within the district attorney's office about the case and about Chambers's handling of it. Senior officials began questioning whether pursuing the parole violation had been wise, given the broader controversy it had generated. The case that Chambers had seen as an opportunity to demonstrate his prosecutorial skill was instead creating political problems and unwanted scrutiny of office policies. A week after the hearing concluded, the judge issued his decision. He found that while Johnson had been present at a location where individuals with criminal records were also present, the evidence did not establish that Johnson had engaged in active association with these individuals for criminal purposes. Being in the same nightclub as other people who happened to have records did not constitute the kind of association that the parole terms prohibited. The parole violation allegation was dismissed. This legal outcome was predictable, given the evidence and the legal arguments, but the significance of what had occurred went well beyond the specific ruling. Chambers' aggressive prosecution had triggered responses from community leaders, civil rights organizations, media outlets, and political figures that had created costs for the district attorney's office and had generated questions about office policies and practices. What Chambers had intended as a demonstration of prosecutorial skill had instead become a demonstration of poor strategic judgment. Within the district attorney's office, the aftermath of the case created consequences for Chambers. Senior officials questioned his decision to pursue the case so aggressively without considering the broader implications. They noted that his confrontational presentation in court had personalized the proceeding in ways that made the office appear to be targeting Johnson rather than simply enforcing parole conditions objectively. They observed that the political controversy the case had generated could have been avoided with more careful handling. Chambers found himself being assigned to different types of cases, moved away from high-profile organized crime prosecutions and toward routine matters that generated less public attention. His colleagues understood that this reassignment reflected displeasure with his handling of the Johnson case. Within 6 months, Chambers requested a transfer to a different office, seeking assignment to a suburban district attorney's office where he could continue his legal career away from the political complexities of Manhattan criminal prosecution. The request for reassignment was granted. Chambers left the New York District Attorney's Office in late 1964, having learned that aggressive prosecution without understanding the broader social and political context created risks that legal skill alone could not manage. He had believed he could outsmart Johnson through superior legal preparation and courtroom tactics. Instead, he had discovered that Johnson's power came from relationships and capabilities that existed outside the courtroom and that could make legal victories irrelevant if they triggered responses from community institutions that the prosecutor had not anticipated. The victory was visible and verifiable. The parole violation was dismissed. Chambers was reassigned and eventually left the office. More significantly, the case established that aggressive parole violation prosecution targeting prominent Harlem figures would generate community and political responses that created costs for the district attorney's office. This created deterrence against similar cases in the future. The immediate aftermath brought stability. Johnson continued living in Harlem and conducting his activities without further parole violation allegations. The district attorney's office became more cautious about how parole cases involving Harlem residents were handled, mindful of the potential for community mobilization and political controversy. Chambers' departure meant that one prosecutor who had misjudged the situation was replaced by others who had learned from his mistakes. But the deeper significance of the case took years to fully manifest. The incident demonstrated clearly that power in criminal justice contexts was not determined solely by legal arguments in courtrooms. Prosecutors might have formal authority to bring cases and present evidence, but if their prosecutions triggered responses from community leaders, civil rights organizations, media outlets, and political figures, that broader context could determine outcomes more decisively than the quality of legal arguments. This lesson influenced how prosecutors approached cases involving prominent Harlem figures for years afterward. They learned that aggressive prosecution without understanding community dynamics and political implications created risks. They learned that framing cases as personal contests rather than objective enforcement of law generated scrutiny. They learned that legal skills were necessary but not sufficient for successful prosecution when defendants had the kind of community integration that Johnson possessed. The community institutions that had responded to Chambers's prosecution also learned valuable lessons. They learned that coordinated responses from multiple sources, religious leaders, civil rights advocates, media, community organizations, could create pressure that influenced outcomes in criminal cases. They learned that framing individual cases in terms of broader systemic issues made those cases politically significant rather than merely legal matters. They learned that documentation and public attention could force prosecutorial accountability. These capabilities were used more systematically in subsequent years. When prosecutors made decisions that appeared to reflect discriminatory enforcement or selective targeting of Harlem residents, community voices spoke out. When cases seemed to represent broader patterns of unfairness, advocates documented those patterns and demanded explanations. This did not eliminate aggressive prosecution, but it created accountability mechanisms that influenced how such prosecution was conducted and which cases were pursued. For Johnson personally, the case validated his understanding of where power actually came from. Chambers had believed that Johnson's influence rested on cleverness and intimidation, and had approached the case as a contest of legal skills. But Johnson's actual influence rested on relationships with community institutions that created capabilities Chambers had not understood or anticipated. When Chambers addressed remarks to Johnson in court, suggesting that Johnson was trying to outsmart the legal system, Chambers revealed that he did not understand what Johnson actually did or how Johnson actually operated. Johnson did not spend his time looking for legal loopholes to exploit. He spent his time maintaining relationships with churches, community organizations, political leaders, and residents who valued what he contributed to the neighborhood, despite his criminal activities. Those relationships created a network of support that could be activated when Johnson faced challenges from authorities who did not understand or respect the community's interests. This was sustainable power. Power that did not depend on being smarter than prosecutors in legal arguments, but rather on being valuable enough to the community that community institutions defended you when you were targeted. Chambers had superior legal credentials and had prepared thoroughly for the hearing, but his legal skills were irrelevant once the community decided that his prosecution represented unfair targeting and mobilized to create political costs for continuing it. The phrase, "asked for a reassignment," became associated with the case in Harlem's oral history. It referred not just to Chambers's specific departure from the district attorney's office, but to a broader pattern where people who tried to challenge Johnson without understanding the full context of his position eventually retreated because they discovered that the challenge created more problems for them than for Johnson. This pattern was taught to younger people entering various fields: criminal justice, community organizing, political advocacy. The lesson was that formal credentials and technical skills were not sufficient for dealing with complex community situations. Understanding relationships, respecting community dynamics, and recognizing sources of power beyond formal authority were equally important. People who ignored these considerations and relied solely on their professional expertise often found themselves outmaneuvered by people whose power came from different sources. When Johnson died in 1968, 4 years after the parole violation hearing, the incident with Chambers was remembered as one of many examples of how Johnson had navigated challenges from authorities who underestimated him. The story was told not to glorify Johnson's criminal activities, but to illustrate principles about power, community relationships, and the limitations of formal authority when confronting people with deep social integration. Chambers's career continued in suburban prosecution, where the political and social dynamics were simpler, and where his legal skills could be effective without needing to navigate complex community relationships. He practiced law for many years and handled many cases successfully, in contexts where formal legal authority was sufficient. But his time in Manhattan and his attempt to prosecute Johnson remained a cautionary example of what happened when prosecutors approached cases as purely legal matters, without understanding the broader social and political environment. The courtroom where the hearing had occurred continued being used for criminal proceedings for decades. The case was not memorialized in any official way, but lawyers and judges who had been present sometimes mentioned it when discussing the relationship between legal arguments and broader context in criminal cases. The specific details of the hearing were less important than the general lesson it illustrated: that power in criminal justice was never purely legal, that community relationships could shape outcomes as much as courtroom advocacy, and that prosecutors who did not understand these dynamics could find their legal victories turned into professional liabilities. The result was louder than anything said in the courtroom. Chambers had stood before the judge and characterized Johnson as someone trying to outsmart the legal system through clever manipulation of rules. Johnson had responded, not by matching Chambers in legal argumentation, but by activating community relationships that created a context where Chambers' legal arguments became irrelevant. The prosecutor's attempt to demonstrate his superiority had instead demonstrated his misunderstanding of what he was actually dealing with. This demonstration was more convincing than any legal brief could have been. It showed concretely that Johnson's position in Harlem rested on foundations that prosecutors could not reach through courtroom proceedings. It proved that trying to target Johnson without understanding and addressing his community integration would generate responses that made prosecution counterproductive. And it established that legal skills, however impressive, were insufficient for dealing with situations where power came from relationships rather than from formal authority. The legacy lasted because the lesson was fundamental and broadly applicable. In any domain where formal authority interacted with community power, understanding the full context was essential. People with impressive credentials who relied solely on their technical expertise would be outmaneuvered by people who understood how social systems worked and who had built relationships that gave them capabilities beyond what formal rules recognized. Chambers had thought he could outsmart Johnson by being better prepared legally and more aggressive procedurally. Johnson had shown that this entire framing was mistaken, that the contest was not about legal cleverness at all, but about understanding communities and building relationships that created power formal authorities could not overcome through courtroom tactics. There was no celebration when the parole violation was dismissed, or when Chambers requested his reassignment. Johnson simply continued his life in Harlem, maintaining the relationships and conducting the activities that had always been the actual source of his position. Chambers departed for a different office and a different career path. The transition happened quietly, without dramatic confrontations or public acknowledgments. But people who understood what had happened recognized its significance. A prosecutor with impressive credentials and thorough preparation had challenged Johnson, believing his legal skills would be sufficient. Johnson's response had demonstrated that the prosecutor fundamentally misunderstood what he was dealing with. The result had been professional embarrassment for the prosecutor and a request for reassignment to somewhere less complicated, while Johnson remained exactly where he had been, supported by the community relationships that had always been the foundation of his position. This outcome was more complete than any dramatic courtroom victory could have been. It showed that Johnson's power was not vulnerable to the kind of challenge Chambers had mounted, that prosecutors who approached situations this way would fail, regardless of their credentials or preparation, and that Harlem operated according to dynamics that outsiders needed to understand rather than dismiss if they wanted to be effective. The quiet nature of the victory made it more powerful, not less. There were no theatrical moments, no dramatic speeches, no public humiliation. Just a prosecutor who had made strategic errors, requesting reassignment to a different office, and a defendant who had activated community relationships to make aggressive prosecution politically unsustainable. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. Formal authority and legal expertise were not enough when confronting power that came from community integration, and people who did not understand this would discover their limitations through professional consequences rather than through courtroom defeats.